From 86 to 2016, the worldview of the yellow forces in our country dominated the thinking and actions of most Filipinos. Yellowism, or Dilawan ideology, is a system of moral, political, and economic beliefs which has normative prescriptions and modalities for regulating and regenerating Philippine society. It provides a narrative around which the life of the nation was structured. A whole new generation of young Filipinos has been brought up with this belief. In 2016, however, an epoch making shift took place with the election of President Rudy Duterte. To many, this marked the end of the yellow orthodoxy. In this episode of The Cusp, I'm going to try to explain what happened, what led to the rise and collapse of the yellow doctrine in our country, and the ongoing search for something to replace it. February 25, 1986. The EDSA People Power Revolt ended with the exile of President Ferdinand Marcos to Hawaii and the dawn of the yellow regime. What followed was the drafting of a new constitution and a return to the old practices under which the republic was set up under the American Commonwealth era of the 1930s. The yellow regime espoused the belief that moral rectitude, liberal democracy, and free market capitalism would lead to social and economic progress. This was patterned after Reagan's Republican Revolution that redefined politics in the US at the time and gave rise to a coalition of faith-based social conservatives, neoliberal free marketeers, fiscal and defense hawks, who were for reducing the welfare state and in favor of a more robust military. I'll explain how this orthodoxy infected yellow ideology in subsequent episodes, but for now, I just want us to note the parallels. The exponents of this belief were the Catholic clergy, moneyed elite, academia, media, the professional police and military, and some progressive cause-oriented groups. They became the EDSA, or Yellow Coalition, so named after the yellow ribbons that were meant to signify solidarity with the slain Senator Benigno Aquino Jr. The church and big business supported Marcos right after martial law, as a way to preserve the old order, following the student protests that culminated in the first quarter storm of 1970s, where the breakdown of law and order, led by the hippie boomer generation of the time, threatened to upend the moral, political, and economic order. These conservative elements withdrew support from Marcos when his government no longer suited their interests. Following EDSA, the Constitution and legal codes of the country observed the norms that the church and moneyed interests fostered. Any attempt to reform these were met with vehement or tacit opposition from their ranks. The media and academia, which were suppressed under Marcos, returned in full force. While providing a venue for criticizing the yellow regime, these institutions reinforced it and upheld its narrative for the most part. Because by doing so, it proved that the freedom of the press and expression had been restored under the liberal yellow order, despite, of course, the continual killing of journalists that took place. The yellow regime didn't need to resort to force to control the narrative. It had the media and academia on its side, which was, in a way, a stronger form of mind control. The professional police and military, however, exemplified by the generals Fidel Ramos and Alfredo Lim, who stood by the principle of civilian supremacy over the military and the principle of chain of command, prevented a return to dictatorship or military adventurism after EDSA, and they formed a crucial part of the EDSA coalition. EDSA created the democratic space that afforded progressive groups representing the varied causes of organized and militant labor, students, and agrarian communities the ability to voice concerns and even attain some representation in the political system was a mark of the post-EDSA era. This had never happened before under the old republic. So despite the continuous suffering of harassment from security forces and some vigilante groups under the new regime, these progressives at least benefited from some of the democratic space that was afforded to them. After a period of calm and progress following the declaration of martial law, Marcos fell into what many regard as the pitfalls associated with highly concentrating power into one's hands. This caused his government to go astray in the eyes of many. I've prepared 5 episodes that tackle each of them, which you can view separately, and the links will be in the description below. But his government represented a morally and fiscally bankrupt state to the creditors and the clergy that then opposed him. Run by technocrats who relied on scientific knowledge, they disregarded the divine order with their population policy of family planning and sanitized the regime in the eyes of the creditor community, legitimizing it despite the presence of extractive crony capitalists that went against the prescriptions of the IMF and World Bank. This atheistic scientism led by the technocrats eventually caused economic bondage, so the yellow narrative goes. They delivered debt-driven growth, which created a bubble economy, and then a precipitous collapse after the Latin debt crisis, when creditors came a-knocking at our doors, leading to severe economic contraction, hyperinflation, poverty, and a diaspora of labor overseas. The Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, led by Manila Archbishop Jaime Cardinal Sin, undertook an ecclesiastical repudiation of these excesses under Marcos's regime. The often quoted passage from the Bible framed their clarion call towards repentance. It was even put to song. And it goes, "If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray, then I will hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land." Senator Benigno Aquino Jr.'s own spiritual journey became the template for this narrative of redemption that the Yellow forces were shaping. His meteoric rise in the Old Republic as a third-generation politician from Tarlac, leading him to become the presumptive successor to President Marcos in 1972, was followed by his humbling experience of imprisonment, deprivation, and isolation, and his subsequent revival as a voice from the wilderness, followed by his assassination, was a model for the moral arc of justice espoused by Yellow ideologues. Moral politics, the Filipino nation as the chosen people on a journey towards progress, followed the biblical archetype of the Israelites chosen by El Shaddai, who led them out of slavery in Egypt through the wilderness into the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. This fit in with the economic orthodoxy of neoliberalism with its faith in the market as the only true way to lift people out of poverty, the prosperity gospel that evangelicals in the US turned to in the 1980s, said that we could have all the good things in life if we claimed it in Jesus' name. This belief in progress attracted religious forces to cause-oriented groups in the Philippines. Liberation theology led many Jesuit volunteers and scholastics like Father Albert Alejo to believe that freedom from poverty was something that we could expect in this world and not have to wait for until we passed into the next life. Even a branch of the military calling itself the Reform the Armed Forces movement held prayer meetings during this time, seeking moral guidance in the lead up to EDSA. And of course, we know that Gringo Honasan was the leader of this group, whose plan to assassinate Marcos eventually led to the hold-up in Camp Aguinaldo, which eventually led to the EDSA revolt. Just as the glorious revolution in Britain had a religious dimension to it, so did the peaceful revolution of EDSA. The bloodless revolution in the 1680s in Britain sought to restore parliamentary authority over the monarchy. Parliament, which was dominated by the nobility, didn't want to pay for the wars that the king declared through higher taxes without being consulted by him first. This is what sparked the Glorious Revolution, and later formed the basis for the Boston Tea Party and their cry of no taxation without representation, which led to the American Declaration of Independence. In the same way, the EDSA revolt of the 1980s sought to restore the authority of the old aristocracy over the central power of the presidency under Marcos through the restoration of democratic checks and balances. The morality of good versus evil, as Nietzsche put it, overtook the morality of good over bad. The morality of good and bad, which was, as Nietzsche called it, a morality of the blonde beasts, the strong, the rich, and the noble, prevailed in Rome before its Christian conversion. This is what Marcos's dispensation represented. In paintings, Ferdinand Marcos and his wife Imelda were depicted as Adam and Eve, or as, in local folklore, si Malakas at si Maganda. Note that in that creation story, Adam and Eve partook of the fruit of the tree of knowledge because doing so would make them like gods. The pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful, Plato's triad, was taught to Imelda by Adrian Cristobal, the chief ideologue of the Marcos regime. Truth or knowledge, in this case, meant being led by a technocracy in the pursuit of progress, a secular mode of governing based on what was deemed good, as established by science and economics, which resulted in things like the Population Commission, Bataan Nuclear Power Plant, the construction of dams, the light rail transit, and many more. Imelda led the pursuit of beauty through the arts, palatial surroundings, and opulence. This was the morality of the good and the bad. Good in this world was pursued for being good in and of itself, not because of some divine ordinance. Anything that didn't live up to its lofty ambition was deemed bad. When Pope John Paul II requested to be brought to the slums of Manila during his papal visit, Imelda's Human Settlements Ministry immediately proceeded to whitewash the shanty squatters areas of Manila to make them look more presentable to His Holiness. If the Philippines wanted to become a rich land, it had to look and dress the part, after all. Excesses in this morality of the good versus the bad among the heathen led to Christian slave ressentiment, a term used by Nietzsche. This drove them to adopt their own morality, the morality of good versus evil. Christian morality is based on the meek shall inherit the earth principle. It sought to reverse the morality of might makes right. Under this morality, weakness is a sign of strength, humility leads to power, and the fear of the Lord, the beginning of wisdom. The slave revolt was led by clergymen who themselves were members of the aristocracy, but broke away from their own ranks to become leaders in this new order, one which repressed man's selfish ego and prioritized piety. But even with the Catholic clergy on their side, with some members of the oppressed aristocracy whose assets were sequestered by Marcos under martial law. The Yellow forces needed to convince the powerful American government, the hegemonic patron of the Philippine client state, to support them. The American-backed IMF turned from becoming a doting parent to a vengeful god when Marcos's regime was exposed for its debt-driven, extractive crony capitalism. They needed a scapegoat to pin the whole economic malaise on, and eventually that scapegoat would become Marcos and his cronies. This is where the morality of the moral majority in the US played its part. America supported Marcos until the very end. Reagan was particularly a staunch supporter. He even invited Ferdinand Marcos to Washington, where he regaled members of Congress with his epic Maharlikan war stories. There was a close bond between the two hardliners. Senator Benigno Aquino Jr. witnessed the Republican Revolution at its height during his furlough in the US from 1980 to 1983, Reagan's first term. Aquino appealed to the evangelical wing of the party, which was becoming a mainstream political force at that time, by appearing as a guest on the 700 Club with the Reverend Pat Robertson to talk about his spiritual awakening in prison. He narrated during that interview how he came across a book written by Chuck Colson, a former Nixon aide who went to jail for his role in Watergate. Colson was not pardoned by Gerald Ford, but in prison he became a converted born-again Christian and subsequently ran a prison ministry after finishing his sentence. This was Ninoy's way of convincing the Christian right in America that he was one of them, despite having been sentenced by a military court in the Philippines to death by firing squad for conspiring with the communists to depose President Marcos. At a speech in Los Angeles, Ninoy described himself as a proponent of Christian socialism, an ideology that was aligned to centrist politics in Germany and Protestant Scandinavia. Ninoy read the Bible in jail, but continued to pray the rosary. He was caught clasping his hands with the beads of the rosary as the plane carrying him from Taipei approached Manila International Airport on August 21, 1983. The iconic picture of him in a meditative, trance-like state as he recited the various mysteries before meeting his maker with equanimity. Ninoy, it must be said, might have pursued a different path if he had lived, compared to Cory, who never forgave the Marcoses after his death, and acted somewhat vindictively towards them. Ninoy had overcome the resentment and existential angst that had consumed him in the early years of his imprisonment, particularly after his hunger strike. This higher level of consciousness that cognitive scientists say comes after altering our usual biological rhythms through deprivation of the senses, led to a detachment from existing reality. The archetype of Jesus who went into the desert in isolation and fasted for 40 days and nights, was tempted by the serpent and came out of it with insight before beginning his ministry. This was the archetype that Ninoy was following. Ninoy, to many of his comrades and family members, was physically, mentally, and spiritually reformed after spending 7.5 years in prison, many of which in solitary confinement, and going on an extended hunger strike, which led to his cardiac arrest while exercising in Fort Bonifacio. He jokingly justified breaking his deal with Imelda regarding the terms of his medical furlough in the US, saying that a pact with the devil was not a deal at all. But all joking aside, he was willing to find common ground with his arch nemesis, President Marcos, whom many in the opposition regarded as the personification of evil due to the thousands of human rights abuses committed under his watch. Ninoy was pursuing a politics of accommodation with the former dictator through a power-sharing deal that he was proposing to pave the way for a smooth transition to democracy, to ensure stability and prevent bloodshed. This was based on mutual respect and compromise. He preached the politics of reconciliation with his former jailer and oppressor. The irony is, it seems he had transcended the morality of good versus evil, while at the same time becoming the poster child for it after his death. The morality of good versus evil remains to this day with the Yellow Forces, applying a woke purity code that condemns anyone who doesn't agree with their version of the truth. I doubt even Ninoy would pass their purity tests if he were alive today. The EDSA coalition didn't include the communist forces. Progressives on the left were massed at EDSA, but at the periphery. They had boycotted the 1985 snap elections and didn't support Cory's candidacy nor participate in her administration. When she spoke before the US Congress after assuming the presidency, her famous line about extending the olive branch of peace to the communists, but willingness to pick up the sword of war if negotiations for their surrender were to bog down, became an instant hit within the Reagan administration. Alex Bongcayao, who later led the Sparrow Brigade, a hit squad of the NPA, New People's Army, was part of Ninoy's Laban slate in the 1978 interim Batasan Pambansa elections. But the road out of economic bondage would follow the standard neoliberal path under the Yellow regime, not a Marxist, Leninist, or Maoist one. We have just spent this time describing the origin story of the Yellow movement. Origin stories are important because they give us insight into the animating feature of whoever it is that we're describing. By knowing its backstory, we grasp its central motive for being. As you can see, moral politics of the Yellows formed a coherent worldview, was based on the mythos of the Israelite escape from Egypt and into the Promised Land. It was consistent with the moral, political, and economic philosophies prevalent during that time. And it gave the people who believed in it a way of participating in that journey, a way of enacting, of adopting an identity within this story and assigning roles to other people within that society. To Marcos, his family, and his cronies was assigned the role of the scapegoat. In the Old Testament, a goat was used to carry the sins of the tribe. It was forced to leave the encampment and to wander and go into the wilderness, carrying the sins of the people out. And that was the role that was given to Marcos. He was literally driven into exile away from his country by not just the Filipino people, but also the American forces. He was scapegoated by them for the failure of the IMF and World Bank-backed economic policies that were being implemented in the Philippines, for failing to produce the economic prosperity that it had promised. And by so doing, he allowed the country to be purified of that sin. And for the Yellow forces now to adopt a new path towards the Promised Land. As you can see, this moral political worldview provided a way for people to make sense of their world and their history, and to see themselves as active agents in bringing about a turning point in that history. And this is why this narrative gives so much meaning and purpose to its adherents who follow its orthodoxy and its teachings up to now. But worldviews provide cultural blinkers as well. It's a prism through which to see the world, but also to filter reality. What happens when this reality no longer conforms to your ideals? What happens when it fails to explain the world? Do the people who hold these blinkers abandon them? Or do they continue to tell themselves or delude themselves to reject reality in order to keep this prism? During the past 30 years, there have been many instances where the mental models on which this moral politique was founded got challenged. Periods of potential rupture. We are going to discuss them in subsequent episodes. But the basic orthodoxy held up during these moments and even experienced a renaissance up until 2009 after Mrs. Aquino's passing, which led to the election in 2010 of Benigno III. In the next episode, we are going to look at what happened during the ascendancy of yellow ideology, how it became the dominant mode of existing in our society, and the beginnings of the end as the mental model failed to predict the future, which led many to question it and to search for new modes of being. Thank you for listening. This has been another edition of The Cusp. I'm Doy Santos. See you next time.